Thank you. Well, thank you very much for coming along. My name's Kevin Collins. I'm a senior lecturer here in the Engineering and Innovation Department, part of the STIP group here at the Open University, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about systems diagramming, some experiences inviting people to draw. Before I do any of that, I need to acknowledge quite a few OU colleagues, some past and present. Fortunately, Ray is still present. Andy Lane, Chris Blackmore, people you may already know, and also Simon Bell and Natalie Foster, who I've worked with on many different occasions doing some of the work that I'm describing, and also some of my own work. As Ray sort of mentioned this morning, we've been doing a lot of systems thinking, teaching and practice over the years at the Open University. I'm not going to go into detail about this, but there's a lot of free resources on our Open Learn site if you wish to do so. An overview of what I'm going to briefly talk about. What do we do when we do diagramming? Diagramming some of our research teaching, some experiences and insights that draw out from that. I'm going to talk a little bit about equity and inclusion, and maybe at the end something about the future of diagramming, just depending on how far we go. But I was also conscious when I was sitting at the back there, I was thinking, I'm talking to you about inviting or thinking about the experience of inviting people to draw, and frankly, you need that experience before I start talking about it. Otherwise, it's not going to mean a great deal. So, in 30 seconds, I'm going to ask you now, in the next 30 seconds, to draw me drought. Drought. Okay? 30 seconds of drawing drought. If you don't have access to a pen or paper or some other means, you can draw it in your head.
Yeah, that's what
Okay, you got 10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We can't quite say lift off, but there's too many people in the room to kind of engage in a discussion what you've drawn. But I imagine, and you can kind of put your hands up on this one, most of you have drawn something either associated with lack of rain or heat, correct?
Yes.
Yeah? Anybody done anything substantially different to those two things?
The impact on people and animals and plants.
Okay. Anybody else done something?
I drew a cracking soil.
Cracking soil?
Dead plants and even, well, people very unwell.
Okay.
And some of it, my mind went to conflict, so tank.
Conflicts. Okay.
I just drew a bloody great empty circle.
Bloody great empty circle. That says as much about him as about drought. And at the back, the last one at the back.
I did, you can see here, I did use some rain, but I also did like a sort of institution for this building, and the sort of institution's role in droughts. So,
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Did anybody include freezing temperature? Nope. Okay. One of the driest places, one of the droughtiest places in the world is Antarctica. Okay. So most of you will have had a framing of drought as heat and lack of rain. In Antarctica, there's certainly lack of rain. It's one of the driest places on Earth, and it's also one of the driest and droughtiest places on Earth. And that's your mental framing of what drought does. And so you've drawn that, and you're using that as your starting point. Now we could talk all about the content, but what was your emotion of drawing that? Some of you may have thought, oh, flipping heck, what's he asking me to do that for? Some of you thought, I haven't got a pen or paper, what am I supposed to do? Some of you might have thought, hey, this is really quite interesting, never thought about it. Or others may have said, oh, I know that, it's easy. But your emotion of engaging with that question is really a lot about what we're doing when we're doing diagramming. So hang on to what you've just experienced as I talk a little bit more about what we've been doing.
Sorry to interrupt. Did you say feelings of competency as well?
No, but I do get onto that. Yeah, certainly if you're not an expert in that area, you'll be thinking, what do I know? I don't know a great deal about this subject. Why is he asking me? But maybe I've got some experience I could draw upon. So, my garden is dried out, the soil is cracked. I could use that. Or maybe I'm an expert in hydrology. I did this once with a bunch of hydrologists, and it was a very interesting experience, I can assure you. Anyway, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Situation, to understand it, we need pictures. So I'm going to kind of take these two quotes and sort of use this sort of sense of all diagrams are incomplete, but they're all useful for understanding and learning. So that's a kind of starting position. We've been using maps and diagrams to map our mental models of the world for millennia, as long as we've ever started scratching around on bits of paper. Here are some very different interpretations. For all the geographers in the room, you'll realise what those all mean. Here's another very interesting example of diagramming. Francis Crick and Watson, and the point of discovering, well, having discovered what DNA structure was, they didn't actually know how to draw it. And they realized there was another group who was going to actually produce a paper which had a drawing of DNA, which they knew to be wrong. And so they rushed out a paper, and they said, well, how are we going to draw it? We needed some sort of diagram. And neither of them were very good at drawing. And so Francis Crick asked his wife, Adele, who was an artist, to come up and to translate that sketch that he did to something that was meaningful for the paper. And that's what she came up with, which is fortunate because she was mostly an artist of nude models. And that's what went into the Nature paper. And that has become the default sort of view, the starting point of the DNA structure. So we're using models really important in the way that we structure our thinking and representing that thinking. And here's sort of three basic ways we can use diagrams. They're analog diagrams, representing reality as close as possible, schematic maps, things like that, and then there's conceptual. Diagrams of systems that don't actually exist, but we can use the sort of conceptual framing of those to understand some of their characteristics of what we might observe. Why do we do diagramming? This is a really interesting question. This is quite a complex quote by Buchanan, and I'm slightly wary I've got time to talk about it, but basically Buchanan was saying we never see a system. We can never experience or see the totality of a system that we exist in, even though we can feel its influences or some aspects of it. So we use maps, not maps, we use symbols and representations of that system in order to make sense of that totality which we're trying to grasp. And then Giardino says we have diagramming as the capacity of optimizing the interplay of our cognitive resources by relying on an external cognitive tool, i.e. a diagram. So we're an interplay between what we think, putting it down on paper, and then saying, oh, that's what I think, that's interesting. I didn't realize I thought like that. Anybody recognize this?
Darwin.
This is Darwin's notebook. And this, to me, is one of the absolute epitomes of the purpose and usefulness of diagramming. It's a really small notebook, it's only about that big. You don't need much if you've got a really good mind. At the top of this piece of paper, I don't know if you can see it there, he says this really important phrase, I think. That's at the top of the page. Okay, wow, there's a statement. And then he's gone on to draw a sort of spray diagram or a tree diagram, whatever you want to call it. It's the proto-tree of life, and he's labelled different parts. And then he's gone on to do something really interesting. He's actually interpreted or explained the diagram, something I try and get my students to do all the time. And so he's identifying what's happening in here through a narrative explanation. What he's doing there is really interesting. He's making sense of a messy situation, evolution, pretty messy. He's reflecting on his own learning in these two spaces, but he's also communicating with himself about how he's understanding it. Because up here on the right, or your top right, he has come back to the page and made some changes and sort of reiterated what he's thinking. So it's a really powerful little document of the purpose and value of diagramming. Absolutely amazing. So, Diagramming, we can look at material practice, the actual act of producing things. Dynamic practice, where we're generating, exploring, testing hypotheses. It's a social process, cognitive process, where we're sharing and collectively engaging with ourselves and each other. And ultimately, it's an epistemic practice, where we are creating knowing in action and through social learning. So, I must move on, otherwise I will not do justice to my colleagues. Here are some things that we've been doing in our teaching. These are current modules, not just all of our modules, but these are some of the ones that I've been involved in over time, or other key colleagues. And what we're trying to do here is we use postgraduate as well as undergraduate, and the work I've been doing in undergraduate environment, which is my background, is been very much trying to introduce systems thinking to environmental practices, environmental management, sustainability discussions. And you're not going to be able to read this. This is just for reference. These are all the different projects we've been working around the world with Ray and myself and other colleagues, and all sorts of different work on human environment systems, trying to use diagramming and systems inquiry to explore these complex human environment system relationships. So, just to sort of summarize then, why we're using diagrams, we're using them to exploring complex situations, representing systems of interest, and you'll all know what I mean by that, exploring boundaries, analyzing structure processes, as well as co-creation. So some examples where I've used it, here we have, you can use diagrams individually to make sense of the situation you have, rather like Darwin. You can put yourself in Darwin's shoes if you like, and diagram for yourself and explore your own understandings. And here's a colleague of mine working in Spain who's trying to understand his work in Spanish agroforest ecosystem, if I remember correctly. Here's another colleague's, and this is a much more kind of a social process where we're using diagramming. And you can see my colleagues over here making sense of their system, agro-system in Sardinia. And what's interesting in that piece of paper there is a blank. And then I came back 10 minutes later and that blank space had been filled in. And it's through discussion they were filling it in. You can see, if you come up close, there are different people who've contributed to this map of understanding the system they're trying to work in. So they're diagramming as a way of making sense of a complex situation. And then in a more structured process, Ray have referred to some of the work we've done in Australia this morning, systemic inquiries. Here's one I did on drought, in fact, in the UK. And what we're doing here is we're using diagramming techniques as well as kind of expert information going into the discussions, and diagramming as a way of making sense of our own understandings as well as expert information, such that by the end we can come out from a position where what do we mean by drought, right through to what are we going to take, what actions, priorities do we think we're going to need to take to address drought conditions, and so on. And then in another process which Ray and I are involved in, some systemic inquiries for the governing the Anthropocene. This was run in Germany, we did this. And here we have a slightly different type of mapping process, conversation mapping, where we're engaging with 100 or so people, trying to kind of look at their experiences and understanding of governing the Anthropocene. And you can see here people drawing maps at their tables, but then other people coming to the table to see and experience what they've been talking about. So very collective, aggregating, exploratory, as well as process. And here I think is Martin. Martin, that's you.
Is that me?
That is you. Yeah, there you are, look. Looking very serious and very engaged at that moment in time. And ultimately using systems, maps and other techniques to kind of draw out from all of this complexity, confusion, uncertainty into something a bit more structured to understanding priorities. So, experiences and insights. Oh God, you expect me to draw? This is what, when you say to people, please draw me something, people just think, it's usually that kind of slight stall in their breath. Most people sometimes experience that sense of scaredness, frightening, fear, whatever you. It's because most people actually stop learning to draw at about the age of 7. So we just not taught it. No. And then, we come to a systems course, right, you're going to draw, and everyone's like, how do I draw? So everyone's expecting this. When you say draw, they all think this. Or not everybody, of course, I'm being exaggerating, but there is that sense in which if you can't do that, you can't draw. and therefore you can't diagram. If anybody can do that, please see me afterwards. I'll be very happy to take it off your hands. So here are some kind of emotions, and I did mention emotions right at the beginning. This is a bit of a disingenuous diagram because it isn't that cycle, of course. It's a much more complex. But we have fear, embarrassment, confusion, nervousness, indifference, boredom. Bit of ridicule and fun, both of sense of others. So when somebody draws something, you think, God, that's rubbish, you know. But actually quite useful because then you realise other people are as bad as you or as good as you. And then you get that surprise, insight, exchange, learning. And there's this kind of constant interplay between all of these things as the group develops. And as the group, in some of the situations I showed you, as they begin to work together for 5-10 minutes, they start to move into much more this side of the diagram rather than this side of the diagram. And it becomes very quickly a kind of, if you have to think carefully about this, it's a negative feedback process in terms of worrying about fear and embarrassment, and it's a very positive process elsewhere. But framings and competencies are really important, and what we see in a lot of diagramming is the language and concepts are absolutely key, because through diagramming you can actually explore the language people are using and the conceptual framings that they're using. But we find that a lot of people want to draw the system out there, and Ray touched on this morning, that kind of ontological sense of systems existing out there, or systems that you are creating in your mind to kind of make sense of that messy world. A lot of people also want to draw the perfect system. They want to get everything in. And solution seeking. So they want to draw the system so that it provides a solution. They want to diagram something towards a solution. And then there becomes all sorts of questions around perspectives and boundary judgments. Whose boundary judgments make sense here? So this is kind of tension which is sort of explored a little bit in Checkland, but as Ray was talking about this morning, a lot of people were diagramming at this level, systematic type diagramming, because that's where their traditions of understanding come from, and the fewer people are used to or normally engaged with diagramming at this level, or more importantly diagramming at the whole of that level, both levels, and the integrated whole of that. And the other thing a lot of people do when they're diagramming is they forget themselves. And it's quite important that we often struggle to remind people, put yourself in the picture, literally, if you're doing a rich picture, but also where are you if you're drawing system maps? Are you a stakeholder in this? As a researcher, have you stepped into the situation, or are you still remaining outside the situation? And therefore your diagramming skill or your ability to diagram what's happening in that situation varies. So we always encourage our students to think about, where are you in this diagram? Because that's often not the case. It's often people are looking at the situation from outside. A bit like I was outside in the corridor, I could observe some of you, but then I stepped into the situation and I had a totally different experience of who was actually in the room. When I was out there, I could only see this part. I come in, I see all of you. And then the other thing I mentioned about Darwin was his interpretation. He actually wrote what he had drawn, or he interpreted that, and we really struggle with that with some students particularly. They just think, well, I've done the diagram. It's obvious, isn't it? And so having that interpretation helps you solidify and consolidate your discussion, your ideas, but also communicating to others. Engaging with different contexts. I put flags up here because I was trying to work out how to show from different contexts. I'm extremely aware that putting flags up is a choice, and also they are diagrams in themselves. They are there to represent things, and we invest meaning and values into those diagrams depending which allegiance you do or don't have. So that's just one context, okay? The other contexts are very much the different roles and disciplinary traditions we have, the ways of knowing. These are so sort of key. Diagrammings are absolutely key to revealing how we know about the world about us. Seniority, in some country contexts, seniority is really important, and a senior level person wouldn't be seen dead diagramming. Okay, they just think you're just being childish. You're almost offending them, asking them to draw something. And so this whole expectations and purpose of things become really important about when you're diagramming. How many? 5. I thought you said 1. I thought, blimey.
No, I wouldn't do that too.
So engaging with different contexts, diagrams are really useful for doing that, surfacing these different contexts, but there are sort of all sorts of issues you have to be aware of. In some sense, in some situations, diagrams are not appropriate. So I did say I'd touch on equity and inclusion, because diagrams being visual obviously have implications for people who do not work visually, or unable to engage with visual materials. They also have issues for people who find learning and processing of information and communicating that information in visual forms quite difficult, and so that has an issue for how you diagram. It's also a social process sometimes. So some of the, like if you had particular issues with certain things and you were in this situation, you might find that horrifying. And some of our students would absolutely not be in that situation, and some people would not. So there is a self-selecting group in here, which is obviously has implications for whose view is being included in the diagramming process. Then there's gender, cultural, educational, the role of people in terms of their professional or otherwise, age issues. Language both in terms of English, French, German, but also language of disciplines and how that changes. And then there's time. What time do you have to contribute to all these things? So equity and inclusion is really important, and I don't think the literature really touches enough on this in terms of diagramming aspects. So the future of systems diagramming, these are just some thoughts. In 1992, I think it was, Avison et al. Started talking about drawing software and how it provided a sort of reductionist, a very hard appearance and formality and structure on things, and over-complexifies. And if that isn't true in this PowerPoint, which is quite infamous, from the American Army about how to win a war in Afghanistan, that's what they did. The technology allowed them to put everything in, but in putting everything in, it just made no sense. So this issue becomes more problematic, and so as we become more used to drawing with software, we're losing connection with the paper, we're losing potential knowing and action, and there are also EDI actions. In recent years, this is right in the middle of the beginning of the pandemic, I was running a project with the Environment Agency and others, and we suddenly had to switch. We were all going to be doing a workshop, we all had to switch to doing something online. This is from Miro. And so we all had to sort of suddenly learn how to collaborate and diagram online in real time. So literally, what are we going to do right now? And so this is great. It's flexible, fast, shareable, everything else like that. But did we really engage with it? Did we own it? 2. Yeah, better. I thought I had 1. That's even better. Are they usable? How do we interpret them? And then again, the digital divide that comes through that. And then finally, AI. Oh, AI. I tried this out a few weeks ago. What I did, I didn't want to put a diagram. I didn't want to register with ChatGPT and all that. But anyway, I put in, draw me a systems map of a pen. Okay, and immediately it came up with this, which is great. And then I looked at it, I thought, this is all wrong. Okay, a format is completely wrong. It's given me a system goal for a start, which is system map, system goal. And then it's given me something like this. It started talking about nodes and arrows. That's not a systems map. So it's fast, it's professional looking, potentially. It's amazingly flexible, but it has many formatting and rule errors in there. And unless you've got that critical understanding at the beginning of diagramming and know the sort of techniques and the rules and sort of baseline what it should look like, there's a real danger that AI is just going to produce a whole load of rubbish in terms of systems diagrams. So that's something I think the community needs to be aware of, how students, how other people outside the community are going to use this type of technology, but without real understanding. And so I've got 2 slides there. One of the advantages of systems diagram, I'm going to stop. I can't talk about all of those because I used it up on drought, unfortunately, or fortunately. But hopefully you've got a sense of what advantages drawing brings, but also what disadvantages, and ultimately they can be really useful in revealing differences, but they won't solve the differences. They become devices for discussion that enable insights, but they are not of themselves the magic solution.
Thank you.
Thank you.